Okay,
It's good.
I think it's good. Okay, my name is Brett Underwood, and I'll be presenting. I am the Associate Director of this with the Northwestern Initiative in Russian Philosophy, Literature, and Religious Thought, and it's an honor to be with you here today. My paper is entitled Nothing from Nothing, The Underground in Sergei Bulgakov and Nikolai Berdiaev. So this article compares how Nikolai Berdiaev and Sergei Bulgakov used the literary figure of the underground man to explore problems of freedom, evil, and their relation to what Mikhail Epstein has coined the greatest metaphysical mystery, the cosmic origins of nothing. My argument begins with the premise that Berdiaev and Bulgakov approach the underground man as someone whose will is grounded in nothing. The underground man, in their view, seeks a freedom that parallels the void from which God fashioned humans. For both thinkers, evil is coterminous with the liberty to unmake what God has made. Yet Berdiaev and Bulgakov differ in their understanding of the nothing towards which the underground is headed. Part one, the underground. Against the fashion of his time for rational egoism, Dostoevsky created a repugnant egoist in the underground man. His claim is that humans want freedom to choose more than they wish to act in their best interests. The paradoxes that the underground man sustains as a result, self-adoration as loathing, freedom as self-imprisonment, exposes the inadequacy of such a ground. The underground man is a free will grounded in and headed for nothing. Now we move to Berdiaev's consideration of the underground. In Berdiaev's 1934 work, Dostoevsky, he begins with a typical summary of the underground man. As his rebellion at rationality morphs into self-love, this anonymous paradoxicalist moves from the surface of the earth to the underworld. Here, the underground man reveals that boundless freedom is possible through the destruction, quote, of human freedom and the decomposition of personality, end quote. Irrational freedom swears by originality, and the result is infinite regress. Yet Berdiaev assumes that mutiny in the underground interrogates more than the life habits of modern intellectuals. The target of his revolt is God. The dialectic is that humans can only destroy God by superseding God. If humans are to replace God through becoming gods, they must first extinguish their humanity. This argument follows Ludwig Feuerbach on the human capacity to emulate and supersede the divine. Deification, so conceived, is actually apotheosis. Berdiaev regards such a Feuerbachian dialectic as a dead end. Nevertheless, in the right dosage, the underground man's example can jolt modern folks from their spiritual slumber. He shows that the, quote, road to liberty can only end either in the deification of man or in the discovery of God. In one case, he is lost and done for. In the other, he finds salvation. End quote. The underground man for Berdiaev clarifies the stakes of existence. Our free will is the capacity either to deify God or to turn toward God, grounding the human will in the divine rather than in nothing. Berdiaev regards the underground man as a spiritual stage, which, however fraught, is wisdom-bearing. His revolution against the external order recovers an interior depth which Berdiaev believes has eluded Western civilization since the Renaissance. The havoc wrought by the underground man allows onlookers to peer into the soul's farthest reaches. Below the surface, one uncovers hidden tempests, the ferocity of which reveal a, quote, struggle in man between the God-man and the man-God, between Christ and the Antichrist, end quote. In the underground of the soul, Berdiaev insists that, quote, the abyss opens up, and therein God in heaven, the devil and hell are revealed anew, end quote. The underground man shows that the conflict between good and evil is not a clash between God and humanity, so much as between the divine and the demonic. The field of battle lies within each human creature. God and the devil take up arms amid the fluctuations of the underground, within the enigmatic depths of the heart or will. The underground man, according to Berdiaev, shows, quote, that evil has a deep spiritual nature, end quote. Moral depravity is nothing short of demonic. Berdiaev's point is that the self is too divided between virtue and vice for the latter to dissipate on its own. Evil must be actively subdued. Evil's chameleon nature further complicates matters. Berdiaev writes that, quote, evil comes forward under the appearance of good, and one is deceived. The faces of Christ and Antichrist become interchangeable, end quote. The soul is torn between groundless liberty and groundless license. Evil begins to seem so pervasive, so substantive, so intertwined with the soul, that, as Berdiaev would later state, the feeling of evil becomes a metaphysical feeling. In presenting the underground as a bottomless abyss, Berdiaev is elaborating upon his own interpretation of the mystical thought of Jacob Boehme. As Berdiaev speculates, quote, if Dostoevsky would have developed to the end his teaching about God, then he would have been forced to recognize the polarity of the divine nature itself, to have found in him also a chasm of darkness, thus approximating Jacob Boehme's teaching of the Ungrund. The human heart is polar. The heart is embedded in the abysmal depths of being. A review of Berdiaev's reading of Boehme will help us to clarify the metaphysical backdrop of this notion of the underground. Berdiaev interpreted Boehme as suggesting that God and the universe are founded in the Ungrund. He also would refer to the Ungrund as meon, which is Greek for non-being. Following Boehme, or what he took to be Boehme, Berdiaev presumed that prior to God and creation was groundlessness, non-being, or nothingness. Berdiaev does not mean to suggest absolute nothing. Nothing signifies a vacuum that is home to formless energy and is analogous to a feral will. In the beginning for Berdiaev is nothing that is indeterminate freedom. Berdiaev refers to this relative nothing as the first divinity. A moral, rational God arrives later. God's creative acts, according to Berdiaev, impose harmony on this anarchic nothing while relying on its vitality. Human beings made as they are in God's image replicate this dynamic. Berdiaev assumes that God and humans contain within themselves a dark source of groundless energy. God and humanity emerge from this ungovernable yet indispensable nothing. Both live in tragic self-conflict with the dark residue of nothing until the end of time. Only humans interact with this source in a manner that leads to evil. The underground is where this ambiguous freedom of primal nothing is stored in humans after the fall. So the underground man for Berdiaev points down towards humanity's self-division, up towards God's self-conflict, and back towards the free and stormy void that was at the dawn of the cosmos. Berdiaev implies that the underground man is the closest approximation to this cosmic absence. And all the qualities that Berdiaev ascribes to the underground, Ungrund, or meon, he also attributes to the underground man and his habitat. The Ungrund is arbitrary, free, formless, irrational, and agnostic. So is the underground man. It is as if he wants to return to nothing, to replicate God's own birth from nothing. The underground man's project is one of decreation. To decreate is to side with the devil, to choose to unmake oneself in order to become God. Berdiaev's notion of evil as the freedom to uncreate is not wholly discordant with Christian opinion. Groundless freedom oriented towards nothing is close to Augustine's concept of evil as privation. But his metaphysical backstory for evil is a deviation, and Father Sergei Bulgakov would take note. Part 2, Bulgakov. Bulgakov's most lengthy exploration of the underground occurs in Unfading Light. As he states, humankind is marked by genius and nothingness. The underground is the inside out of being. Every creature has an underground, although he is able not to know this. By sinking into it, each person lives with the eerie cold and dampness of the grave. To lock oneself in one's creatureliness, as in the absolute, means to want the underground and to be affirmed in it. The real hero of the underground is Satan, who fell in love with himself as God and turned out to be captive to his own underground. Bulgakov, like Berdiaev, interprets the underground man and his type as persons engrossed in a hapless demonic revolt. These subterranean rebels lust after freedom only to witness their efforts climax in an enslavement to their own egos. Here is a will headed for nothing. But for all their parallels, Bulgakov is actually distancing himself from Berdiaev. To be persuaded, one must read the footnotes. Bulgakov inserts a citation after pronouncing Satan as exemplary of the underground, and gives the following appraisal of Berdiaev's meaning of the creative act. The contradictory nature of creatureliness, woven out of divinity and nothingness, does not admit the imminent divinization of humankind, which constitutes the distinctive feature of Berdiaev's anthropology. The creative impulse and the frenzy of the underground merge indistinguishably in the creative act as he proclaimed it. So Bulgakov criticizes Berdiaev for awarding the dubious, perhaps diabolical, economy of the underground too prestigious a role in human improvement. He assumes, as do most Orthodox theologians, that the process of redemption can begin now, and that it takes the form of divinization, which properly pursued is not blasphemous, but salvific. Christian theosis stands in contrast to Feuerbachian apotheosis, which we talked about at the beginning of the paper. The doctrine of theosis outlines a path towards deification, in which humans do not compete with the Creator or deny their nature as contingent creatures. Bulgakov assumed that unless deification is conceived as the culmination of a process that human beings can undertake now, then humans and their material environment are deprived of their inherent goodness and worth. The cosmology of Berdiaev, for Bulgakov, was case in point. Bulgakov's criticisms seem fair. One could argue that they're fair. Berdiaev did assume that chaotic potentiality was integral to the tragic side of the cosmos, residing with the underground of souls until the eschaton. And he would have agreed that the salvific nature of function of creativity underscored the integration of evil within nature, because the creative impulse arose from the amoral, uncreated energies of the underground. Bulgakov doubted whether creativity so defined could guarantee, however, the future deification of humanity, let alone at present. Bulgakov discerned in Berdiaev's view of human nature a view of human nature that is as powerless as it was pretentious, qualities which Bulgakov associates foremost with the devil. Bulgakov uses the underground to construct an alternative picture of interiority. Berdiaev sees in the soul a capacity for colossal depth, which he refers to as the underground, to which Bulgakov counters in Unfading Light, quote, "There are two abysses in the human soul, dead and nothing, an infernal underground, and God's heaven, which has imprinted the image of the Lord," end quote. Bulgakov is expanding an argument that he made prior in Russian Tragedy. Here he insists that Dostoevsky's line, that the struggle between God and the devil occurs on the battlefield of the human heart, not be taken to suggest that evil is tragically interlaced with the good. And to make this point, He notes how Stavrogin's character is, quote, ominously, infernally not there, end quote, for much of demons. His truancy confirms in Bulgakov's view that Stavrogin represents the forces of evil. Quote, possessed by the spirit of non-being, his personality is reduced to a psychological skeleton iron will, end quote. Stavrogin shows that evil as a form of nothingness swallows up its victim. A peculiar tragedy ensues. Bulgakov reads Stavrogin as so disconnected from his body that he can no longer act. He serves as a provocateur who stokes fire in others' hearts, but, quote, he himself does not burn and is obviously incapable of igniting, end quote. He is a medium who receives others' hopes for salvation only to pervert them within the vortex of his own interiority. Stavrogin is a black hole, a black grace that becomes visible only as it devours. Bulgakov considers Kirillov to be the most tragic of Stavrogin's victims. His demise, Bulgakov claims, quote, discloses the religious abysses of the human spirit. The language of abysses, plural, is significant. Stavrogin's interiority represents a single nefarious void. Kirillov, on the other hand, possesses two bottomless trajectories. One is angelic and the other demonic. The tragedy is that the simple-minded heart of Kirillov is primary. Stavrogin corrupts Kirillov's pure love for Christ and all of creation into an idol of self-will. Messianic wrapped dreams become the vessel of, quote, not atheism, but anti-theism. Kirillov hopes to rescue himself from God by refashioning himself into a God-man. Yet he cannot supplant the actual God-man in Christ. He can only dismantle what God has created. And he discovers devastatingly that, quote, outside of being is nothing, non-being. Kirillov's theological declaration of independence, as many of you know, concludes in suicide. And for Bulgakov, Stavrogin's subjective vacancy illustrates that evil does not have a legitimate claim to actuality. Its venom is incompatible with living flesh. Evil is no facile mimicry of divine freedom and creativity. It is rather its negation, a, quote, rape of the image and likeness of God in all its materiality, end quote. The underground recapitulates Stavrogin's interiority. It is a place, Bulgakov suggests, where demons make their intentions clear, as they did in the Gospels, by propelling swine from an escarpment. The underground makes room only for corpses. Bulgakov later implies that such Dostoevskian meditations were thoroughly Augustinian. In Unfading Light, he endorses Augustine's notion of evil as a corruption of good being. Evil for Augustine and Bulgakov does not have, quote, independent significance, end quote. Evil is like a parasite which perishes after sucking its host dry. Any attempt to prove otherwise devolves into parody and tragedy. Moral depravity for Bulgakov cannot participate directly in the good. Neither can evil compete in a straightforward manner with goodness. Stavrogin shows that evil is not a subject, but subjectlessness. Evil is not a thing, but a process towards nothing. One can now parse Bulgakov's image of the soul. There is, on the one hand, the rebellious nothing of the underground. Here the self assumes that it is without limit, and the outcome is the corporeal flotsam of the Gerardine abyss. Then there is celestial nothing, or the heavenly abyss. This space is characterized by pregnancy rather than entropy. The underground cannot contribute to the life-giving objectives of the heavenly abyss, for it resides in an absence that is too far removed from God's being. The heart is split between a heavenly womb and an underground tomb, and never the two shall meet. But there is more to say of nothing. Bulgakov's underground man does not pursue dynamic nothing, or meon, as we talked about at the beginning of the paper. The underground man yearns for the limit beyond which lies dead in non-being. The underground for Bulgakov points to an absence that resembles the Christian account of quote, pure empty nothing, non-being before the world creation. Here is not the meon, but the ukon. The underground facilitates Bulgakov's attempt to distance himself from Neoplatonism. And according to Bulgakov, Neoplatonism presumes that creation is an involuntary emanation or emission from an abyss that was seminal and internal to God. He saves his most vehement critiques for a vein of Neoplatonic thought that runs from Burma to Romantics to Russians like Berdiaev. For these thinkers, emanations were grounded in a flawed primordial abyss of nothing. According to Bulgakov, they held that nothing evolved dialectically to resolve its deficiencies. And this mixture of automatic emanations and primeval voids contained a larger agenda than the explanation of the genesis of the world. One could also comprehend the disparity between the imperfections of creation and the goodness of creator. The question of evil was integral to Berdiaev's enthusiasm for Burma's Ungrund. He reasoned that if freedom and chaos were prior to God, then, quote, God was not responsible for the evil that comes from freedom. And the idea of self-upgrading nothing awarded him an explanation for evil, an alibi for God, and an assurance that the cosmos could one day defeat the suffering of the Ungrund. Berdiaev saw a risk in explaining away evil in this manner. One could mask the damage through panegyrics to freedom, but to naturalize moral error through evolutionary dialectics did not solve the problem. Evil seemed natural and the cosmos impersonal. Bulgakov worried that emanationism rendered the idea of receiving creation as a gift unintelligible by blurring the line between God and the world, giver and gift. Neoplatonism, in his view, trends towards pantheism. And since pantheism jettisons transcendence, Bulgakov further conflated pantheism with atheism. Berdiaev's cosmology, in Bulgakov's eyes, was a gateway to atheism. Berdiaev invoked the underground to delineate history as a series of emanations from a dynamic nothing. And the first emanation was God. Bulgakov, by contrast, is not concerned with the relationship between the underground and an abyss that is prior to God. Bulgakov is focused on the nothing that existed at the beginning of the world. And he employs the underground to uphold the idea that God creates from a void so empty that the world must be the result of a divine fiat, a volitionary fiat, rather than an emanation. Bulgakov's contention is that the world is created out of nothing in the sense of the ukon. And only this concept could be revered as a gift. An emanation was too passive to be good. The problem is that creation ex nihilo, or creation ex uhan, is a difficult idea. Nothing can come from nothing, Parmenides averred. Bulgakov really recognizes that Parmenides will ever raise his voice, insisting that only that which is meon exists. There is no ukon. Contra Parmenides, Bulgakov asserts that something can, in fact, come from nothing. The cosmos begins when God creates the ukon, or pure nothing, in a moment of self-delimitation. God then converts ukon into meon. God creates the conditions for the world to emanate from the meon. Nothing comes from nothing, meon from ukon, for Bulgakov. That phrase upholds creation ex nihilo. But how can God, the fullness of being, create pure nothing? The full negations of being. Accusations of absurdity can be assuaged by noting that Bulgakov is working with a qualified conception of pure nothing. Not once does Bulgakov refer to the ukon as absolute nothing. Bulgakov has deemed that pantheism's identification of God with everything was tantamount to atheism. Conversely, Bulgakov implies absolute nothing is only possible if God does not exist. The ukon must be a different type of nothing, one that stands in relation to creation and to the possibilities of free will and evil. For Bulgakov, the ukon is neither located before nor outside God. The ukon is at the edge of God. Here is a nothing devoid of any potentiality associated with energy. Bulgakov is willing to concede that ukon retains a causal link to the source of all potentiality in God, so long as one does not reduce pure nothing to a finite causal process. The ukon contains potentiality, but it is of a more derivative sort than meon. The ukon provides space, and thus the possibility for creatures to accept or reject meon, the potentiality which God has gifted. The ukon is not absolute nothing, but the bleakest echelon of relative nothing. I'm coming close to the conclusion. Bulgakov does not offer an exhaustive explanation for the origin of the world. Neither will he settle for fideism. He insists that, quote, to identify what has been accomplished is for human consciousness fully in keeping with his powers, end quote. Creation is not explicable so much as intelligible. One must reason implicitly or illegitimately in the underground. As he writes, the absolute null of being as its sole pure possibility, without any actualization, remains transcendent for the creature, which always represents the indissoluble alloy of being and non-being. This naked potentiality in the underground of creatureliness is like some pseudo-center of being, competing with the source of its fullness. For the heroes of the underground, it summons in them an irrational blind will towards nothing. Nihilism, the cult of nothing, exists only at the expense of the positive forces of being. The heroes of the underground misconstrue meon as unmediated, indeterminate potentiality. And we may conclude that since pure possibility is not actualizable, it breaks the alloy of materiality and nothing, matter and meon. Decreation is synonymous for Bulgakov with dematerialization. Comprised of pure, naked, or butte potentiality, the underground is preset for a rewind, the decomposition of meon into the ukon, the plunging of the creature into its original dark nothingness. Bulgakov agreed with Berdiaev that the underground comprised an ill-fated venture to be reborn within a primordial chasm. But he did not credit the underground with authentic depth. Underground dwellers exposed naked potentiality as emaciated rather than purified, because it was grounded in a void lacking in potentiality. Bulgakov conceived of the underground as tragic only to dismiss that its ruinous energies could ever be repurposed for the good. Evil lacked any natural abode in the heart, in the cosmos, and in God. Berdiaev and Bulgakov defined meon as a life force. Berdiaev, however, equated meon with potentiality. Bulgakov saw naked potentiality as closer to ukon than to meon. Meonic non-being, in his view, was something with ontological reality, in contrast to the nothing of ukon. And the potentiality of meon was not unreal so much as unknown. Bulgakov was certain that meon was not creativity out of nothing, but creativity in nothing out of divine something. Berdiaev assumed that meon propagated itself because it was uncreated. But for Bulgakov, meon was creative because it was radically created. The primarity qualities of meon, non-manifestation or non-definition, pointed to a surplus rather than a deficiency of perfection. Meonic non-being could do no less than nourish the whole wealth of being. The sublimity of created meon accentuated that ukon for Bulgakov was not evil. Only the attempt to return and to create out of the ukon was evil. Creation was an unrepeatable act of grace. Berdiaev thought that both divine and human creativity drew from a source of uncreated potentiality, and any teaching otherwise suggested the desire to humiliate humans or put down humans. Bulgakov thought that Berdiaev merely made creatures seem better by making the creator seem worse. Moreover, absent a gulf between God and humanity, there was no basis for creaturely dignity. Humans could not become God because there was no prototype to become like. So Bulgakov thought. Bulgakov showed the distinction between God and the world was a receptacle for evil, without which evil was quickly redistributed into divine and human hearts. And so if it is not clear for Berdiaev whether creativity or the gears of history save, it is likely because he may have been more cynical about the capacity of humans to manage their own depths, their own dark depths, than he often came off. And so perhaps Bulgakov was right. Berdiaev only espoused creative gestures, not creative actions. The underground, in conclusion, the underground allowed Bulgakov and Berdiaev to analyze gradations of nothing within human interiority, and ultimately within the void out of which God created the world. Bulgakov criticized Berdiaev for extolling freedom as a panacea while trusting automated processes to usher reality to its appropriate telos. Berdiaev, in his view, fetishized the deep. He believed in creativity, but he did not believe in creation. And the price was steep. God was not transcendent, and evil dug itself further and further into reality. Bulgakov, meanwhile, articulated a vision of interiority that was not quite as juxtaposed to creaturely life. He contended that the material world was a gift along with the nothing on which it rests. This gift could be celebrated in the heavenly abyss of one's soul. The underground was foremost not a failure to create, but to receive the creation and its gift and its creator as good. Thank you.